Hello again. Two videos in one day. This is just kind of like a little quick stats side quest that I went on. So I was kind of from being at a lot of the Leinster matches, obviously watching all the games throughout the season, listening to a lot of commentary, a lot was kind of being said, and I was kind of noting when I was making my notes for the game of the amount of penalties that Leinster were giving away, and I kind of wanted to have a look at, does Leinster have a penalty problem this season? So I went and I looked. So basically, I'm looking at the 11 games they played so far this year, 9 in the URC and 2 in the Champions Cup. And I'm comparing it back to this in a similar point of the season last year. So when they played 11 games, which would be 9 in the URC and 2 in the Champions Cup. So just looking at the past 11 games this year, between the 9 in the URC and the 2 in the Champions Cup, I assumed that Leinster had a penalty problem, that the penalties were really mounting up, especially compared to last season. It felt like this season every game seems to be 10 plus penalties per game. And they're currently in last place in terms of discipline in the URC if you look at the stats. However, when I looked at the actual figures, they were actually lower than last year's, which kind of surprised me. So I compared the number of penalties for Leinster's first 9 games of the URC and the 2 games of the Champions Cup, both this year and last year. And Leinster have actually given away less penalties this year. They've only given away 95, which is still quite high, but it's less than the 102 at the same point last year, which kind of surprised me. Also, they're averaging 10.6 penalties per game this year in the RC compared to 11.3 last year at the same point. While in the Champions Cup, Leinster conceded 17 in their first 2 games this year, but they conceded 23 last year, with the average penalties per game now at 8.5 compared to 11.5 last year. Overall, the average penalties per game across their first 9 games of the URC and 2 Champions Cup games is 10.2 penalties per game. This is compared to 11.4 last year. As I looked at the distribution of attack and defence penalties, and it's pretty much exactly the same compared for this season and last season, with 37% of penalties being from attack and 63% being from defence. The only kind of real change in the terms of like what type of penalty was in terms of the scrum. It's gone up slightly. So last year it was 23% of the penalties were scrum penalties, where it's now 26% this year. However, the biggest kind of standout in terms of the penalties for me were the percentage of penalties kicked against Leinster. Also in terms of yellow cards and red cards. So the percentage of penalties kicked against Leinster in the URC, only the URC, I don't have these figures for the Champions Cup. It doesn't actually give you these kind of kicking stats on their website. So it's just for the URC. The percentage of penalties kicked against Leinster has gone up from 6% last year to 13% this year. So 13% of the penalties awarded against Leinster have been scored against them. Just to clarify, this is only the successful penalties kicked against Leinster. I don't have if there was missed kicks and things like that. This is just the actual successful penalty kicks against Leinster. So 19% of the points scored against Leinster in their first 9 games of the URC have been from penalty kicks, where that figure was 16% last year. So there's a big increase in terms of successful penalty kicks against Leinster. And there's also a small increase in the amount of points scored through penalty kicks against Leinster. So then looking at the cards, Leinster have received 10 yellow cards in the first 9 games of the URC compared to 6 in the first 9 games of last year. So Leinster have an average of 1.1 yellow cards per game this year compared to 0.7 last year. And then looking at the Champions Cup, in the first 2 rounds they received 1 this year compared to 3 last year. So they've actually gone down in terms of the Champions Cup, decreasing from an average of 1.5 last year to 0.5 this year. So across the first 2 rounds of the Champions Cup and the first 9 rounds of the URC this year, they have an average of 1 yellow card per game compared to 0.8 last year for the Champions Cup and the first 9 rounds of the URC. So there's an increase in cards in the URC, also with the red card that was received by Andrew Osborne against Zebra. So while the penalties do seem less. The discipline is still an issue. So just looking at the game last weekend against Connacht, it really did give Connacht an opportunity to get themselves back into the game, get into good positions, and that really slowed down when the discipline got better in the second half. So I just thought that was really interesting. In my head, I would have thought the penalty count would have been much higher for Leinster. The stats seemingly show that their discipline has maybe got slightly better, but they're still bottom of the pack in terms of discipline in the URC. Discipline will definitely be on the mind going into that La Rochelle game tomorrow. They're certainly a team that can really punish Leinster's mistakes, that can really punish penalties in terms of good positioning, in terms of set pieces, especially like, as Leo mentioned, that line out maul, especially the scrum going up against those two inexperienced players of Andrew Sparrow and Jerry Kerr. I think that'll be something that Ronan O'Gara and his team will be targeting. So fingers crossed Leinster can keep the penalties in check and we get a good game tomorrow. Thanks for watching. I just really love kind of looking at stats, and sometimes like you prove yourself wrong, sometimes you prove yourself right, or sometimes you find something more interesting along the way. I hope that was something of interest at least, especially for nerdy stats people like myself. As ever, thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment below, especially if there's any other stats area that you want me to look at. I will have a look at for you. Other than that, I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching. Bye now.